two, one, two, three.
Hello and welcome to Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. Back 10 months ago, I interviewed Glyn Robbins, who was visiting Ithaca to research the work of Abraham Kazan, an immigrant to New York City who became a union organizer and pushed unions to support building cooperative housing in New York City, including the huge co-op city. After the planned interview, we continued talking. He talked about council housing, which is the British way of referring to public housing. That one thing that has inspired a lot of people, and you mentioned Housing Justice for All, they took a bunch of elected officials to Vienna.
I know they did. So I didn't mention this earlier, but by some fluke, I still don't quite know how it happened, but I was a Fulbright scholar in 2021 and I lived in the Bronx. And it's partly how I got more interested in Kazan and his work. I lived not far away from Co-op City, actually. Anyway, because it was still basically COVID, and so I wasn't able to do the work that I was supposed to be doing, if you like, because of that. And so what I ended up doing a lot of the time, particularly in the first few months I was there, was getting involved with Housing Justice for All. So I went to all their meetings and I went to campaign protests and all the rest. And, brilliant. I know there's, as there always are, disagreements around tactics and strategy, and I shared some of that. But, overall, there's a kind of vibrancy and vitality around housing campaigns here in the States, and I've been involved in them as a guest, I suppose, for many years, which we don't have back home. I wish I could bottle some of it and take it back. And Housing Justice for All, I think, with some reservations, I think have done brilliant things. And, essentially making New York State eviction free for about 18 months, I think, in the end.
Well, it was COVID.
During COVID,
Yeah.
was a real achievement. And, it's a real strength. And I watched that, fairly close, and I was very impressed. So yeah, Housing Justice for All are important. DSA, I'm a socialist, so I would gravitate towards DSA if I lived here. I found some of the messaging when I was in New York a little bit confusing around housing, I have to say. And I think it's taken the DSA a while to, fully grasp some of the issues, but I get a sense that they're getting there now anyway. And in particular around public housing, which I know is an issue in Ithaca, but it's obviously a huge one in New York City, where there's a real threat to, it's about 170,000 homes that NYCHA, New York City Housing Authority, have. There's a real kind of onslaught of privatization and demolition. Actually, just adjacent to Penn South, there's a couple of big public housing sites, and NYCHA are going after them, and they're trying to. It's very frustrating from a British perspective because we've lost a lot of council housing through various mechanisms of privatization and demolition. And I can see what's going on in New York as a kind of blueprint almost borrowed from back home. And it's infuriating to me because although I understand NYCHA, I worked for a public housing authority years ago in Jersey City. So, I'm familiar with the issues and I don't romanticize public housing for one moment. And I know how difficult it is. But I think as we are experiencing back home in Britain, you miss council housing, you miss public housing when it's gone. And privatization is a one-way ticket. And I get a little bit concerned when I see people who I tend to agree with on other things seeming to kind of want to go down a sort of quasi-privatization route when it comes to public housing, especially in New York City. And, I think it's a mistake. But anyway, I'm being a
Well,
bit presumptuous. But,
there are certain reasons for that in the
mm,
United States.
mm,
Nationally, there is something, it's called the Faircloth Amendment, and it forbids the national government, the federal government, to spend any money to increase the amount of public housing
mm,
in the United States.
right.
So, for instance, in Ithaca, a whole development, north side of public housing, where the housing authority decided that what had to be done was to tear down what was there and replace it, and replace it with more units than had been there before. But they obviously couldn't do that and had to hand it off to some not-for-profit to do it, to take it over, tear it down, build it up. Um, it's right there in, as I say, North Side.
Right.
Not quite finished, but almost.
Well, there's that saying, isn't there? You don't want to look, it's not a counsel of perfection, and we don't live in a perfect world. And sometimes you have to bend the stick and all that. And I understand all those motivations. As I said, I worked in housing for many years, so I'm very familiar with the practicalities, if you like. But I increasingly feel that no form of private or NGO or non-profit ultimately is going to be able to deliver the homes that we need in the volume that we need them uh, any better than a fully publicly owned organisation that's democratically controlled and transparent. Now, that's easy to say, and I agree with you. There are constraints, and I mean those constraints have been baked into the US public housing system since it began. I've read the history, and the real estate industry lobby made it very clear that they did not want competition from public housing. And basically, that's still the case. So, yeah, I know it's tricky and difficult, but unfortunately, these other models, these sort of mixed ownership, so-called affordable, various other devices that have been tried over the years, they're just not working. I mean, they just are not working. And we've got many decades now of experience to show that. But anyway, I don't know. But some of these things are very familiar because, as I said earlier, there's a kind of global pandemic around housing these days that means that you end up seeing the same kind of symptoms almost anywhere that you go, certainly in this country as compared to back home in Britain. I suppose the thing, well, I might ask you a question, as in, I have to say, I've spent probably too much of my life hanging around in bars. And I've been thinking that I might never have been to a better bar than Pete's Bar. I think it's on South Coger Street, just down the road. And I've been going there these last few nights. It's lovely. It's really friendly, ethnically mixed, which is nice. Anyway, and I get chatting to people in there and I talk to them and try and get a sense of what Ithaca is like. And I must admit, there's been a few conversations I've had which make me think people are worried and scared. I'm not sure what it's about, but I got a feeling it's about a perception of homeless people or people who they feel threatened by. And am I picking that up? Is that wrong? Am I making this up or
Uh,
what?
it sounds reasonable to me. Now, I have to say, I have hardly any bar experience. It just
Just
isn't
as
my
well.
thing at all.
Right. Yeah.
Now, another problem that we have here is our health system.
Right.
Currently, I think probably on average, most mental illnesses don't get treated. I don't know what the situation in Britain is.
I think very similar again. And, you're right to connect the issues. But I always think of John, who, when I was working as the super on the council estate that I managed for about 10 years, we had an empty apartment become available, and John moved in. Now, John was an alcoholic, and he made no bones about it. Um, he was seriously addicted. I got talking to him, I got to know him a little bit, and he said, "Look, I do need help. I do need counselling. I do need these other therapies and interventions around my addiction. But what I also need is a home that I can afford and that I feel secure in." And that was the fundamentals of his life. There's no way people are going to be able to, if you like, be cured of mental health or addiction problems or whatever it might be if they haven't got secure housing. It's just not going to happen.
The,
So,
people
you're right.
are recognizing this.
Right.
I mean, housing first is
Yeah, I saw the
the,
mayor mention it, and that's good. That's good. Yeah, exactly. I think more and more countries, Finland has sort of led the way on this a bit. You mentioned the DSA going to Vienna. I was there. I went there a few years ago, partly to look at the housing, and it's well worth looking at, actually. And there's a history there that's very interesting and again, quite inspiring, a bit like Kazan. But you do not see homeless people in Vienna. I mean, it's not to say there aren't poor people in Vienna. I'm sure there are plenty. But what you will not see is people sleeping in doorways. 60% of the housing in Vienna is classified as social housing. So, there's no mystery about some of this. I suppose where my metaphor analogy of the pandemic kind of breaks down a little bit is that, all right, we have got a vaccine, but that took a bit of a while to find. We know what the solution to the housing problem is, I think, and it's just a question of using it. But that's going to take political action and political. So I watched the Republican candidates debate the other night. I mean, vacuous in a way that even by the standards of establishment politics, I was kind of astonished by it, really. I mean, I know in a way I wouldn't expect any more, but, no mention at all of any of the issues that we've been talking about for the last bit of time. These people are living in a parallel universe. They really do not understand. I don't think they know what's going on in Ithaca, and yet they're going to be coming around for your vote in not that long. So, but again, it's the same back home. It's the same in Britain. Our Labour leaders, so-called, and most of our trade union leadership, they're complacent or resigned. I'm never sure which it is, but, we're not getting the kind of politicians to represent us on this kind of issue as that we need and that we used to have. Even in my lifetime, I remember a time when housing was not really an issue for working class people. It was, I don't know. I guess you took it for granted, and in a way that was a mistake. But when I was growing up, you might see the occasional. We used to call them tramps. I guess the American translation would be hobo. You'd see that very occasionally. But the idea is, as you would see now in my neighbourhood in London, on any given day, you're going to see at least a dozen people sleeping rough, and a lot more than that in certain parts of the city. It didn't always used to be like that. I remember when it wasn't like that, and that's because the policy has become dominated by vested interests, corporate capitalist vested interests. But it doesn't have to be this way, and that's the other thing I always want to talk about, and that's why I like talking about Kazan and council housing, and there are other models, the community land trusts. I agree with your mayor again. He said all of the above, and I do agree with that. I don't think that there's a sort of one-size-fits-all solution here. We do need to, think broadly about the kind of homes we need, but also about the kind of society we want to live in. And going back to what you were saying earlier of, the amount of time people are having to commute and the environmental impact of all of that. Again, we're not gonna have a healthy environment without a healthy housing, and we're not going to have healthy people without healthy housing either. These things need to be linked in together. But so, yeah, I mean, yes, things have changed a lot since Kazan, since the early days of council housing. But I think there's something about that model that is intrinsic and that we could still benefit from, and then we can use that model to particularly to start building more or retrofitting for environmentally friendly housing. I mean, about a quarter of, certainly in Britain, I wonder what it is in the States, probably more, but about a quarter of carbon emissions at home in the UK come from our home, 25%, give or take. Badly insulated housing that hasn't been maintained, hasn't been, of course, then you've got energy costs, etc. Again, these things are these issues are intimately linked, but we need a social model to be able to address them. We're not going to solve the environmental crisis individually, one by one. That is not going to work. We need to be thinking about these things collectively. And again, I think that without eulogizing Kazan and the movement that he was part of, I think they understood that. I think they had albeit that some of them were awful right wingers and red baiters and all the rest of it, they had a sense of class consciousness, actually, which I don't really see from politicians anymore. There are exceptions that sort of prove the rule, I suppose, but broadly speaking, you don't have class conscious politicians anymore. They're not working class. Same at home as here. Most of them are lawyers. Most of them have come from, if you like, a part of the elite. The idea, I was reading something recently actually about politicians in Britain in the 30s, and they almost all, now, problem here, almost all white men, but leaving that momentarily to one side, they were dockers, they were bus drivers, they were miners, they were steel workers. And they had a understanding of working class people's lives, which I just don't think politicians today have got. They're professional politicians, most of them. Most of them haven't, as my dad might have said, most of them haven't done a proper day's work in their life, if we assume that being a politician isn't really a proper job. So I'm not saying they don't work hard. I wouldn't want their lives, but they're not connected. They really are not. They do not understand, I don't think, with some exceptions, they don't understand the kind of pressures that increasing number of working class people are living under.
Well, class consciousness or lack thereof is a strange thing in the United States. And I think it's been demonstrated that working class people are often aware that they are working class people. Middle class people also have some awareness, but the upper classes do not have a consciousness that they are privileged.
No,
I
funny,
have
isn't
this, the funny thing is that we have this right in our marriage here.
it? Okay.
I grew up in Silver Spring, Maryland,
Oh,
a,
really?
a
Interesting.
very middle class suburb.
Right.
My husband grew up in Bethesda,
Okay.
a much more prosperous suburb of DC. We didn't know each other at that time at all. I was always very conscious of the difference, and he just isn't. But we have all sorts of little facts. When he applied to college, he applied to one Ivy League college and got in. When I applied to college, I applied to 4. That was kind of the standard in those days. And my guidance counselor said, can't really help you getting into a prestigious college. Hardly anyone from this high school gets in. I did. But the advice was apply to the University of Maryland, the public university. And I'll have to admit, I didn't do it.
Right. Well, I think it's an
Uh,
important point again, because actually there are real connecting tissues between our housing system and our education system, and obviously our
yeah,
class system. No, I think the point you're making is important. I mean, I'm what you in America anyway called a first generation scholar. So, I think I went to college relatively late. I didn't do that well at school. And I came from a family where education was very much valued and encouraged. And my dad, who was a bus driver, was very almost obsessed actually with the idea that I would, as it were, not be a bus driver, that I would do better. Mum was a teacher. So, that's the kind of background I come from. And I was the first person from my family to go to university, but I didn't go until I was in my mid-20s. But even then, we had a much more, and we're changing the subject a bit, but they're not unrelated. I tell my students now, when I went to college, which was between 1987 and 90, I got a full grant. My rent was about $30 a week equivalent. We could get subsidy for that rent. The whole idea of paying, I remember when I first came to America in 1986 and talking to people of around my age and them explaining to me that they had tens of thousands of dollars of student debt. I couldn't believe it. That was completely unheard of in our country. And now my daughters are in a similar position to probably most kids in the States. They owe tens of thousands of pounds for their education. That has been taken. The principle of free higher education has been taken away from us in my lifetime, in one generation. And in that sense, there is a similarity with housing, because the housing that we used to, as I said earlier, maybe mistakenly take for granted has again been taken away. And I think when you think about it, students have become, the industry actually classifies them in Britain as an asset class. Student housing, and actually it's another thing I noticed about Ithaca, and I'd be interested to get your comments on this, but student housing is, I'm afraid to say, a problem, which is not to say students are a problem. It's not to say students don't have as much right to a home as anybody else. They do, of course. But the industry, the development industry, goes where the money is. And where the money is with students. And obviously that's particularly true here with Cornell. And it becomes part of the problem, but it's similar back home. Developers are building student housing because they know they can sell it, basically. There's profit in it, in a way that building homes for people who don't have a lot of disposable income or can't get tens of thousands of pounds in debt, can't afford it. So it's all part of the, I suppose, overall the kind of uber commodification and commercialization of our lives. And yeah, it's got to change, Theresa. We've got to do something about it. I know we're trying.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, and I think with students here, I remember reading studies, and this was some time ago, when you would study and study and borrow and then not be able to get a decent job in your field. And the researcher would ask graduate students in particular, I think, about it. And so many of them thought, yes, but I will be able to get a job.
Okay.
So there was some sort of a, I don't know, statistically they weren't going to,
Right.
but individually they believed that they could.
So that the debt was a good investment, if you like. The spending
Yes,
tens of
yes.
thousands of dollars was going to pay back. Well, yeah, and it breaks my heart sometimes. I've only been lecturing for a year or two, really, and I'm learning a lot from the students. And actually, you just reminded me that just before Christmas, one of my students came up to me, and I doubt this happens in Cornell very often. One of my students came up to us. I teach at probably what you would refer to as a public university. Most of the students are from working class backgrounds. They're predominantly women and people of colour. And one of my students came up to me after a lecture and said, I'm going to get evicted next week. And it was just before Christmas. And it's a long story and a horrible one. But she did end up being evicted. And her whole life is now in jeopardy because she's been moved to another part of the city, which means she can't get her kids to school, which means she can't keep her job going, which means she's going to struggle to finish her degree. And so you're right. I'm sure she would have taken on, I know she has taken on a lot of debt in the hope that she's wanting to qualify as a social worker, that she'd be able to then have a good career. Actually, mental health is what she wanted to specialize in. It is all now up in the air because she lost her home through no fault of her own. And, it's criminal, really. And, I just think she's I feel like she's the tip of an iceberg, actually. In fact, we're thinking about doing something about it in the university when I get back. Let's try and do some research and find out how many students are in a similar position, that their ability to finish their education and get a return on their investment, if we're going to call it that. To what extent is that being threatened, damaged, undermined by housing? And certainly a lot of my students, it's making it very, very difficult for them.
Yeah. Well, here too, of course. It's funny, I don't recall hearing of students here getting evicted. I think they just, well, the way they live is often a large apartment or a house and 10 or 12 or 15 or even 20 living in the same place.
Right.
Each one paying rent for a bedroom.
Mm.
And so the total rent is huge, even though it may not be so bad per person.
Yeah, no, it's big business, and you only have to walk around. Well, where you are actually, so I notice these things because what I do, I see all the student housing and the real estate agents up there on the hill, and
Hmm.
it's huge. I don't know. I mean, it's probably about a billion, but it's going to be tens of millions of pounds, dollars a year, if not more. And yeah, it's big business,
Oh, yeah. And
which yeah, I don't know.
yeah,
It's out of
we,
control. It's the
yeah.
other thing.
I was talking with Glyn Robbins of London. This has been Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. Thanks for watching.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.